ハロー通訳アカデミーは1996年5月26日に名誉最高顧問の前英国首相マーガレット・サッチャー女史をお招きし、特別講演会を開催いたしました。世界を舞台に活躍し続けるサッチャー女史には、今回国際社会における日本の役割と題してお話ししていただきました。Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to thank you very much for your presence here today at this special lecture by Lady Margaret Thatcher, an Honorary Advisor to Hello Guide Academy. My name is Miho Todoroki, and I'll be serving as the Master of Ceremonies for today's program. I would highly appreciate your cooperation for the proceedings of the program. When Lady Thatcher enters the hall, let us all give her a warm round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, now let us welcome Lady Margaret Thatcher. We would like to commence today's lecture program with a few words from Mr. Genichiro Ueyama, President of Hello Guide Academy.
Lady Thatcher, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome Lady Thatcher, our Honorary Advisor, to address us at this lecture of Hello Guide Academy. On behalf of the Academy, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to Lady Thatcher for her almost annual visits to Hello Guide Academy. Today, Lady Thatcher will speak to us on the subject of Japan's role in the international community. And now, I would like to present one of the greatest political leaders of this century. Ladies and gentlemen, Lady Margaret Thatcher.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it's always a pleasure to come and speak to you. I am very well aware of the importance of tourism to the future of our countries. It increases the knowledge and understanding between peoples as they travel. And frequently, the main impression that visitors to your country will take away is that given to them by their tourist guide. I know full well that this academy trains the overwhelming majority of successful tourist guides. I think something like 80% of the qualified tourist guides come from this academy, which is a very great compliment to you. And so therefore I'm also delighted to be an honorary advisor to it. There is just one other point I would like to make about your occupation. More and more jobs will be found in future in the service industries, in hotels, restaurants, in financial services, in tourism. as manufacturing becomes more and more automated. You will find at the moment that only about 1/4 of the jobs are to be found in manufacturing, and something like 3/4 are to be found in the services, which of course include education and health. So it is very important that we get the training for these jobs right. Now, I have been speaking this time in Japan about Japan's role in the world and about her contribution to the world. There is nothing new, my friends, about Japan being conscious of her role in the world. I hope you're taught history at school, and I hope you're taught it well, because we should all know our background and our history, and that of other people's too. But at the time of the Meiji Restoration, which, as you will recall, I hope, was in the year 1868, there was a complete transformation of Japan, and she decided to go in a new direction, to be more open to the world and to go out into the world, whereas for the previous 200 years she'd been closed. And I was very interested in the instructions at that time. The government said, knowledge shall be sought throughout the world. Very interesting. Go out and see what you can find that will be useful to us in every other country. They formed a big study group, rather a large one, 107 people. The Prime Minister, 7 cabinet ministers, all the most distinguished people in Japan. And they went to Britain and they went to America, and they spent 2 years trying to gather all the best ideas, and then came back and began to transform all the work and the training and the abilities and the products in Japan. Now that, I think, was the first real decision for Japan to go out in the world. And indeed, it shows a Japanese characteristic, which I've learned from my visits here and my contacts as Prime Minister. You always take meticulous care before you come to a decision to find out all the facts and see how they're likely to fit in with your own character and whether you can use them. This does show great wisdom. And it is said, of course, that the definition of genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains or taking trouble. And that is what you have shown over the years with the major decisions, political, industrial, and commercial, that came your way. A byproduct of that visit came much later, when in 1902, Britain and Japan negotiated an alliance. It was the first formal alliance between a major country in your part of the world, in the East, and in our part of the world in the West. The first one that had been negotiated on equal terms. And so the friendship and the contacts do go back quite a long way. After that, of course, history went through many various vicissitudes, but you really have played a major part in the world recently. You are the biggest donor of aid to the underdeveloped world. You're the top donor to 30 countries, and you're the second biggest donor to 20 countries. You also contribute a tremendous amount of the output to this area of Asia Pacific. Let me just give you another figure. You compose only 7% of the population of the Asia Pacific region, 7%. But you produce 60% of the goods and services. Let me just contrast that with your near neighbor, China. The figures are the other way around. She's nearly 1.4 billion. She composes 60% of the population of the region, but produces only 8% of the gross national product. So you see how much and how well your attention to detail, you're bringing Japan into the modern world, you're always keeping up with the best products, with modernization, and also the best qualifications, has really paid off and enabled you to be the main donor to overseas development countries, and also you make the largest single contribution, because it's paid regularly, to the United Nations. The United States obviously makes a bigger one. I'm afraid she's sometimes a little bit behind with her contribution. You are always up to date with yours. It's 14% of United Nations. You are also have been a member of the G7. The G7, as you know, the main industrial countries. Britain is one, America is another. They're the main European countries, but there was always Japan as the seventh one, because you were the outstanding industrial democracy in this part of the world. Your industry was outstanding, and for a long time in the post-war period, you were the only democracy. So there was a double reason why you should be in that very important club. And I met Prime Minister after Prime Minister when I was the British representative. I must say, you changed prime ministers quite often. And I was there nearly 12 years. And I reckon I wore out a lot of Japanese prime ministers. Mr. Nakasone was an exception because he was there 4 years, and we had some continuity, and he was a very good prime minister. We also, in Britain, have a reason to thank Japan. She is one of our main overseas investors. The extraordinary thing is, and there's no reason except that we have more in common than we thought, that Japanese management plus British workmanship go supremely well together. And I had to negotiate with Nissan, your big motor company, the first big investment in Britain, when Nissan came to our country and is making very good profits, is providing employment, and the whole operation is going extremely well. And I'm very happy to report that our output per person employed is every bit as good as yours. Indeed, it's the pride of our work people that it is. So they're getting very well together. Now, the purpose of showing this to you is you have been accustomed to the idea of being in the world. You're being accustomed to the idea of only the best is good enough. You've been accustomed to the idea of investing elsewhere, because getting our economies is intertwined is possibly one of the best roads to peace that we know. And you're accustomed, as you make and create the wealth, to turning around and helping others to create theirs. Because although when we buy goods from lesser developed countries, they often compete with some of ours, we, each and every nation, pulled up our own way by selling to other countries, and therefore we must provide markets for the newly emerging countries to sell to us. As they sell to us, so they make money to buy from us, and that way the standard of living of the whole world rises. Now, just let me also have another little look of history, because another thing we have in common, though you might not think I would put it this way, is that we have both been colonial powers. Now, the age of colonialism lasted for about 400 to 500 years. It started really as some of the great seamen found their ways to other countries across the world, and the Portuguese were the first to come to this area. Consequently, we all built up great empires and of colonial peoples. We were particularly anxious to take the best we knew to ours, to take education, to start to teach them parliamentary government, because in the 14th century we already had a parliament, and also to try to teach them the best that we knew of good, professional, non-corrupt administration. We gathered big empires, but this has been the century in which most of the empires have broken up They lasted a very long time. The British Empire, there are now 51 nations, members of the United Nations, that were members of the British Empire, stemming from India as the largest to some of the small islands in the Pacific, and of course the very largest island in the world of Australia and New Zealand. 51. And we all think the same way. We're all democracies, and so therefore we can bring a better approach to the problems of the world. The French Empire is broken up, the Dutch Empire, as you know, with Indonesia, the Belgian Empire, and also the Japanese Empire, Manchuria, Korea, Taiwan. So we all, Korea is split into two, as you know. We all had problems of empire, and we all had experience of it. But now, instead of a comparatively few members of United Nations, we are a world now of nation states, each with their own pride, each with their own history, each with their own friendships. And whereas when United Nations first started, there were, in the post-war period, there were only 51 members. There are now something like 170. But the modern way is each nation state with its own government, its control over its own destiny. What I have to report is that, alas, although there are 174 belonging to United Nations, only 75, less than half, are democracies. And although democracy is not a perfect form of government, and there are many different forms of democracy, there are certain common features about it which make it the very best government. Namely, the people can choose the government, and they have to re-choose it at regular intervals. So if they don't like it, they can turn it out or replace it. Secondly, they're free societies believing in human rights. Human rights belong to all people. There are some countries in Asia Pacific which try to say, oh, human rights are not for Asia. Asia is different. And we say, look, people, human nature is the same the world over. We all have families. We all take pride in bringing up our children. We all feel pain the same way. We all recognize heroism, bravery, and valor in the same way. We all need to eat. We all need to have friendships with other people. These things are common to people the world over. So, it is democracy. The people are in charge of electing a government, a belief in human rights and freedom and liberty. And you cannot, my friends, and this is probably the most important of all, you cannot have freedom unless you have a rule of law. And by that I mean a rule of justice. Not just laws made by governments like commonwealths, or rules made by governments and then changed at their whims. Laws made through Parliament, administered by judges who are men and women of great personal standing, building up the case law so that you can always get your case heard independently of government. These things, and a market economy, because if a government is in charge of all the production and sale of goods, you do not have a free country. And also private property. Now, those are the characteristics of democracy, and you need all of them for it to be a true democracy and to last into the future. And so, when it comes to this particular area, Asia Pacific, it is coming up economically, as you know, very rapidly. There was a time when you still are the lead nation. You are the second biggest economy in the world in what you produce. And you are the longest standing democracy, apart from, of course, the others right down in the southern part of the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand. But there has been a movement again, as I mentioned a little time ago, to say Asia is different. There's also been a movement to say, since the end of the Cold War, and you're very close to communist neighbors. It must have been a great relief to you when the Soviet Union collapsed. into 15 countries, and the tyranny went, and a good deal of the armaments were started to be reduced. And you're also next to China. This is why we had to look after you so well in the G7. You were surrounded by people who did not share your philosophy of democracy, and also, of course, North Korea was not very far away. So there's a tendency to say, particularly on the part of the left wing, to say Asia is different. There's also a tendency of some commentators to say there will be a clash of civilizations. It was a catchphrase. And some of us say, well, don't be so absurd. There have been great wars in the past, and I'm afraid that the end of the Cold War does not mean the end of conflict. But it's not necessarily the clash of civilizations. It's a clash of the will of a dictator against a free people. The message that I wish to give is that Asia is not different in any way. There's no need to have any what is called revisionism. There is no need to change what we believe is the right way ahead for the world. The right way and the successful way is common to all peoples. What I have just defined as the rules of democracy are the rules we've learned over 700 centuries. They are the rules which make countries of Europe successful. They are the rules which made America successful. They are the rules which India is having to implement now. And she, the second biggest country in the world, is still a democracy and has some very successful industries. They are rules we are trying to get throughout Asia. They are the rules which made Singapore successful, the rules which made Malaysia successful, the rules which make most countries, all of the Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea. These are the rules which have made them successful. But they're not Western rules, they're universal rules. And this must be the message that we get across. If we all of us pursue these ideas of liberty under rule of law, market economy, and constant with local negotiation with other nations, and also international negotiation, both through trading agreements and in international organizations, we can now hope for a better world. That is so particularly since the collapse of communism in Russia. We were coming quite well through this century, except in the middle of the First World War. Russia had an election. It was the first election she'd ever had throughout history. There's a man called Kerensky standing and expecting to win because he'd been in power and had given the first election. At that point of time, Lenin, who lost the election, seized power by force throughout the legitimate government and imposed communism. The idea was these few intellectuals, of whom Karl Marx had been the originator, could plan everything. And by cutting out all the liberties of people, not at liberty to start up their own business, not at liberty to find their own job, no freedom of worship, no freedom of speech, no freedom to own land. It was taken away at gunpoint and people were shot if they didn't yield it up. The idea was these few intellectuals, and I always think they were intellectuals without any feeling for human nature. Not all intellectuals are like that, as you know. Could plan everything, and they would produce a more prosperous society and a better society. Now, and so it was that the world had embarked unwittingly on a kind of economic experiment and an experiment in government between the free world and this total dictatorship of the few. That experiment lasted 73 years. And a man called Mr. Gorbachev saw that it wasn't working as they started to travel the world and see the prosperity that you were getting, that we were getting, that America was getting, that Europe was getting, that every democracy was building, to see the freedom, to see that if you have freedom, you can use your creative talents to make wealth, whether those are industrial, whether they're artistic, whether they're cultural, whether they're agricultural. And so Mr. Gorbachev started to give freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom to elect your own representatives. Once you start giving freedom, the thing runs fast. And as you know, eventually the Soviet Union collapsed. The difficulties now are of people that have not been allowed to use their initiative, have not known any freedom, and been told what to do for 73 years, or the time of their life if it's less, can't suddenly turn round and take an initiative. They're afraid of it. And the other thing is, I think I might have said to you last year, there is no such thing as freedom unless there's a rule of law. And no communist country has ever had a rule of law in the sense of a rule of justice and independent courts. And so what has happened is the mafia have moved in, and the ordinary people are getting really very little chance. And although there's no longer any shortage of food, they are not in fact finding it easy to make the money to buy the kind of food they would wish to feed with their families. So there is a great problem in Russia, your near neighbor. And as you know, they've got an election very shortly in June. I know Mr. Gorbachev, I know Mr. Yeltsin very well. Mr. Yeltsin's a believer in a free society. He's up against people who say, well, it hasn't done so well, and that is because they haven't yet had people trained to do it, and who would like to go back to some kind of image, not quite the same image, to some kind of similar system to what they had before. They'll find it difficult because about 60% of their property has been privatized, but unfortunately it's got into the hands of a few who used to be some of the lead communists, which is not good. We could have helped further, and we could have helped better. But neither we nor you were in a position to do so. You just can't march into a country and say, look, do it this way. You can offer your help, but in the end people have to learn from their mistakes. I must be quite frank with you. I hope very much that Mr. Yeltsin wins. Now, there's just one other point I want to make, and I'll make it quickly. It's not so much a point of international politics. It's a point that is affecting us pretty nearly all. It's this. Whereas I've been talking about the problems between our societies, I just want to say that there are problems within our societies that are giving us just as much cause for concern as the problems between societies. Because I think we've now learned how to live together and keep our defenses strong, that no one will attack us. But within, look, we've got rising crime, rising bullying, burglary and theft, and some people with no thought either for their neighbor, no thought that everyone is entitled to respect and dignity, and we have got the sort of society in crime that we didn't expect to have. You've got bullying in schools, a terrible thing, particularly after that case, a child committed suicide. I know that when I was first in politics, which was a long time ago, it was my first election I fought. I was very young. I was 1950. But we all believed that as we came up to greater prosperity, most of our problems would be solved. Everyone would have a house, they'd have a reasonable education, they'd have a chance to get a job, a chance to earn their own living, a chance for a fuller life. What we hadn't realized is that there's always evil in human nature. And it's very difficult to tame. And the only way to tame it is to have a very strong rule of law within, with a strong, very fair police force, and a strong way of enforcing the law against those who offend against it. Now, in addition to the increasing crime that we're both suffering, we've had crimes of terrible proportions. The one that is on trial now in your country of the poison gases in the underground. The one in my country where a gunman went into a school and shot the young children in primary school class. The one in Tasmania in Australia where another gunman ran amok and in fact shot and murdered many people. And many crimes with guns in America. Now, my friends, we've got to get together to deal with this. Bullying you must deal with in schools yourself. We have very little of it, and if there's any suggestion A parent would be in a school to a head teacher and the board of governors very quickly. Because it's the parents, the teachers, and the board of governors that can say, we will not have this. And if they're bullies in schools, they have to be expelled and go to a special school to be specially taught. You cannot have your children's education ruined by the fear that they might be bullied today, tomorrow, or the next day. Now, these are many of the problems. Also, we've got a problem of a dependency culture. You have it here, I'm sure you have it. Do you have the phrase a dependency culture? What it means is, you've always been conscious that there are some people who can't work or some people who can't get a job, and so you have to look after them. And so they have to have an income when they can't get a job. What we're finding now is there are quite a number of people who are deliberately keeping themselves without work to have an income without work. And the numbers of children who are born to single parents are rising very rapidly. The amount of divorce is going up, and this is undermining our society. Now, we have to get together and talk about these things, because I think we'll only know how to tackle them if we share this problem, which is almost a problem of prosperity. And we have to say, why is it that we no longer have the courtesy, the self-discipline in parts of our society, only parts of it, and the rest of us wish to live in a society that is highly cultured, highly courteous, highly considerate, so that we may be as proud of our people within as we have been throughout history of the example we've been able to give to the world. I see one or two of you looking at your watches, and I think you must be waiting to ask questions. And I am waiting to answer them. Thank you very much for listening so attentively. Thank you.
At this time, we'd like to open the floor to some questions from the audience. The first question will be from Ms. Yukiko Kuroda.
Every time I listen to your lecture, I'm deeply moved by your commitment to expand and sustain democracy in the world. And today you told us that the members of British Empire have been able to learn democracy and the economic system from Great Britain. So my question to you is, when Hong Kong reverts to the control of the People's Republic of China next year, what influence do you think that Hong Kong will have on the democratization of Chinese society, as well as the capitalization of the Chinese market?
Thank you very much for asking that question. I've been very concerned about the future of Hong Kong. The reason it returns to China is this. There are 3 treaties relating to Hong Kong between Britain and China. The first 2 arose from our trading right round to this region, well over 100 years ago. And we wanted a port and a proper trading station. And so we bought some land from China. Hong Kong Island we bought from China. That was not enough. We went back and said, can we have some more land? That Hong Kong Island was only about 4% of the present Hong Kong. So we got a little bit on the mainland. That was another 3% of the present Hong Kong. And then we went back and said, look, this, and we also bought it freehold. You understand what freehold is? You buy it outright, and it's yours forever. The next time we went back, my ancestors, as Prime Minister, went back. They said, look, you can have quite a big piece of land, but only on a long lease. You can buy a 99-year lease. Well, 99 years seemed a long time then, and we didn't apparently hold out for freehold. And that lease, which is 93% of the present land of Hong Kong, that lease ends in 1997. And that's why really the whole of Hong Kong, because you couldn't defend 7%, has to return to China. But the people have come and made a really good living there. Chinese people under a rule of law and liberty, have become wealthy due to their own effort and sound administration of free society. Their income now is $23,000 per head. That's the individual capitalization. Yours, I think, is about 25, a little bit more. They've done that. Now, we were not able, because the Chinese frowned on it very badly, and because they could always walk in at any time, we've not been able to get full democracy there. We have a full rule of law. Freedom, private property, a market economy, full rule of law. But China doesn't like democracy. She prefers a form of communist dictatorship. Deng Xiaoping has given economic freedom, but no rule of law, no freedom of speech, hence they can just put someone in jail after a very artificial trial. And so we had to tread very softly. We now have 1/3 of the Legislative Council elected. The others were appointed. And our present governor said, well, if China will not let us have more by a universal franchise, we'll let those who represent the occupational groups, let each occupational group choose its own representative. Now, that's not a universal franchise. It wasn't breaking the agreement. But I'm afraid China didn't like it, and that's why we are in considerable difficulty with them now. It seemed to us quite common sense to do that. It wasn't a great big official vote under all the usual conditions for having an election. We have been working quite closely with China. Groups of people go up to Beijing regularly to negotiate. Hong Kong, like Japan, incidentally, you have invested heavily in Hong Kong, and you also invested heavily in China. And you've also been very faithful to Hong Kong because you recognize that its financial markets are expert. They're probably, if you don't mind my saying so, the best in the region because they have more experience of a free society the world over and deal the world over. So naturally, we are concerned. Because of that, I made an agreement with Deng Xiaoping, which took 2 years to negotiate. Chinese people don't negotiate quickly, very slowly. And that agreement was, and it was Deng Xiaoping's idea, 1 country, 2 systems. And they could therefore have the second system of capitalism, which is what we've got. And so we could keep that system when Hong Kong returned under the administration of China. We could keep that system for 50 years. And we could also keep our own rule of law with our own independent judges and independent courts for 50 years. And that was put into this agreement. And I said when we signed it, I said to Deng Xiaoping, now tell me, why 50 years? Why couldn't we have had 100 years? After all, we made an absolute jewel of what were bare lands. And there were only 500,000 people there in 1945. I think we've made a jewel out of Chinese people. Look how they've flourished under us and our system. No, he said, we've got to have it back. And he said, it's 50 years, because he said, I reckon that at the end of 50 years, on our side of the border, the Chinese border, we shall have come up to the same level of prosperity. Now, if they play it right, they might get to the same level of prosperity. And the great question is, will, as has happened in every country in the world, which has started out first with economic liberty, Chile is probably the latest example, the people will get used to running their own business affairs and will demand political liberty and a say in the government of the place, because they also have to have a say in the laws which are made, because they're the only people who know the right laws to cover commerce and cover the transactions in land and so on. We believe that that will happen. But as you know, the politics are still rigid. We are naturally worried, particularly in some of the things that are said now. We shall watch that. That agreement is registered at the United Nations. And we should be very careful to watch that it is upheld. And also, Hong Kong will be very valuable to China, provided she can get rid of this little problem that she's got. She will not go to a full democracy herself. Now, there are already, out of 5 million people in Hong Kong, 600,000 have passports. 250,000 of them, 300,000 of them are ours, and others to go overseas. So if there were any trouble, there would be, I think, quite a big exodus of Hong Kong people. One of the reasons why I gave a lot of passports was because to keep a colony going right up to the point of change, you've got to keep your lead people there. You've got to keep your lead administrators. You've got to keep your lead teachers. You've got to keep your lead doctors. You've got to keep your top people in industry. You've got to keep your top people in radio and television, people who actually run the country. I wanted them to keep them there so we could do well by the people, right to the point when it was no longer our responsibility. And that's why they all have passports. So if they choose to come away, they've got somewhere to come to, or other countries to go to where they have arrangements. Or they can choose to stay there according to what happens. So if they're wise, they'll let it still be run by Hong Kong people who know how to run the finances, who are not afraid of competition from anywhere. They're so good. Democracy, we have an agreement in principle with China that they have no objection in principle to it coming up to full democracy, not before the year 2007. And so we hope that gradually they'll allow more and more people to be properly elected by universal franchise. The critical thing in the coming year is to know who they will appoint as their chief executive. They've got a marvelous chief executive at the moment, a lady called Anson Chan. She's terrific. If I were them, I'd keep her on. But we shall soon know, and the kind of person they appoint will give us a clue as to how they're going to play things. But they've every reason to keep it prosperous, well administered, under a capitalist system and our rule of law. So let's cross all fingers and hope. Right, thank you. So that's a long question, but Hong Kong matters to me. Now let's have the next question. I'll try to give a quicker answer.
The next question is from Ms. Soyo Kobayashi.
In most developed countries, women have made great social and political advances. What obstacles still stand in the way of women, in your opinion? And how do you think these problems can be resolved?
Well, I'm glad you've asked that question. What I've found is, having been Prime Minister of my own country, and we have a woman Speaker of the House of Commons, and you have a woman Speaker. The trouble is that the press always say, oh, a woman Prime Minister, a woman Speaker, isn't it a miracle, or isn't it strange? And if only they regard it as not strange at all, purely a matter of ability and suitability for the job, it would be better. As things go on, we shall get people looking at it for suitability for the job and not find it remarkable that people come to the top. After all, women have come to the top in several businesses or started them themselves. Now, what are the obstacles in the way? Two things. Most women will get married. I hope they will. It is the greatest fulfillment in life. And I hope they will stay married to the same person unless something terrible happens. And the family is the essential structure of life. When I was young, Granny used to live with us, and Granny was a great disciplinarian. And there was therefore an extra person in the family. The family is the structure. Now, what is difficult, it's not so much an obstacle, it's difficult for a woman, if she wants to become a member of Parliament. Her home may be a long way away. She can't leave her home while her children are young to go to Parliament. Now, how did I do it? Because I was a member of Parliament with my children. I was lucky I had twins, a boy and a girl, just like that, after I'd been married for about 2 years. My husband's business was in London. Our home was in London. My work, I was a barrister, was in London. Parliament was in London. The constituency I represented, a single-member constituency, was in London. Everything went right for me. Everything. So I could go to Parliament, and when the children were home from school, I could dash home from Parliament to see them. I also had excellent help. You can't do without that. But even with excellent help, you want to see your children. They want to see you. And you feel guilty if you don't. So I was in a position, it's only 20 minutes from Parliament to my home. You could get home and see them. And always be with them. And if you're in the constituency at the weekend, well, it's a question of going up by car and coming back, and sometimes I took them with me so that they took part. So I was lucky. Now, that's the real obstacle. Now, what I say to women under those circumstances is, look, go into your local authority. Become a local councillor or some elected office locally so you get the experience of public work. When your children are independent and offhand. Do you use the same expression? Your children are offhand. What would it be in Japanese? When your children are either doing their own training or going out with their own careers, then perhaps you can contemplate going into Parliament. So most women who come into Parliament come in slightly later because they haven't got duties with their children. So it's not an obstacle really in this sense, but it's just trying to see that your duties and responsibilities at home will be matched in with your duties and responsibilities with your work. And it's vital to keep the family going. I sometimes say to my children, home is the place where you can always come, even when you've got your own families. But you can work it together, but you need a bit of luck to be able to do so. Right, thank you.
Mr. Yoichi Aso. Mr. Aso, please.
Lady Thatcher, the involvement of the United Nations in regional conflict seems to be increasing, but not necessarily successfully. I would like to know what role or function you think the United Nations should play in bringing about peace in the world?
Now, when the United Nations was formed in the post-war period, people said, we have a new world order. It was thought somehow they could stop conflict. They can't and haven't and never will be able to. Nor do you send a United Nations force into the conflict. It's only the United Nations goes in for peacekeeping. When Saddam Hussein, the old-fashioned dictator trying to take other people's territory by force, and there are plenty of them, marched into Kuwait, what did the United Nations do? It passed a resolution that they should withdraw. Could it take any action to make them withdraw? No. This is why I said put so much emphasis on nation states. The action has to be taken by nation states. I was with President Bush at the time. We decided we would send our armed forces to defend Saudi Arabia and to turn Saddam Hussein back. The action is taken by individual states who keep strong defenses. And George Bush put together a coalition. Mubarak of Egypt came very soon, Syria came in, and many other nations sent troops. It was a coalition of nation states. So you've got the message. United States does the fighting. The United Nations does the talking. The nation states do the fighting. And we did. Countries such as yourself, who weren't able to send forces, although you are now spending $50 billion a year on military forces, contributed $13 billion to the cost of that operation, and we were very grateful for that contribution. Other people didn't send any contribution to that. But United Nations passes a resolution which gives moral authority to whatever action is taken by individual states. Now, United Nations didn't get involved at all in the fighting. It's only when there was a peacekeeping agreement through the Dayton Accord that a mixture of United Nations forces and NATO forces go in for peacekeeping. But previously they attempted to put in NATO forces when there was no peace to keep. And it was all a terrible mess in Bosnia. If you want really to look at how not to run any operation, Bosnia was the way. I'm afraid the United Nations never took effective action. They passed a resolution which was directly contrary to what they should have done. There was Serbia attacking Bosnia. She was attacking Croatia, and there was a peace agreement. Under that peace agreement, the armed forces of Serbia were actually put into Bosnia, out of the way. Serbia then attacked Bosnia. And the United Nations passed a resolution that Bosnia, which had no armed forces at all, whereas the Serbs had access to the whole Yugoslav armaments, passed a resolution that Bosnia should not be able to have any arms at all, should not be able to defend herself by purchasing arms. No country was to supply arms to Bosnia. That, I must say to you, was morally wrong. I doubt whether it was legally correct, because every nation has the right of self-defense, and that right is far older than the United Nations. And a later organization cannot deny a right which has been through the ages. So they made a terrible mess of it, as a result of which many people were massacred. By that time I was no longer in office, and eventually spoke out and said, this is wrong. United Nations passed resolutions, but nation states will have to do the fighting. But then, where you've got peacekeeping operations, for example, you now have a peacekeeping force on the Golan Heights, because there are many places in the world where there are conflicts, as there has been for a long time, but it hasn't been a fighting conflict, it's just not been a resolved conflict. And the Golan Heights between Syria and Israel is one of them. And it's going to be very difficult to get that settled. And in my view, you'll have to have a United Nations force on the land in between Syria and Israel. So don't expect too much of United Nations. It's much better for sending humanitarian aid, sending supplies to countries that have earthquakes and are in difficulty, than in dealing with conflict. You see, it doesn't even try criminals, war criminals. That's done at The Hague. So it's good to have it, but don't expect the wrong things of it. Right? Thank you very much.
And the next question is from Ms. Chisa Shimamura. Ms. Shimamura, please.
On July 7th, I will take the National Tour Guide examination, and of course, I'm very nervous about it. I have read your book, The Path to Power, and I was very impressed with how you prepare for and pass the solicitor's examination while busy with your housework, newborn twins, and political activities. With so many demands on your life, how are you able to concentrate on your studies? Can you give us any suggestions?
Well, now look, first let me say to you, don't be afraid of being nervous. You won't do your best unless you're nervous, because your nerves will make you revise and revise and revise right up to the last moment and do that extra bit of work. So don't be afraid of being nervous. Something wrong if you're not. How did I do it? Well, I already had a chemistry degree, but I really wanted to have a law degree as well, because I wanted to be the kind of lawyer that needs both qualifications. You frequently have tasks to do either in patents or in commercial law, where you need both scientific qualification if you're dealing with a scientific industry and a legal qualification. So the first thing to note was I really wanted to do it. Also, as a politician, I had a love of the law and our legal history, which is a very unusual one because it was really good judges that made our original law. And so I had a love of the law for its own importance itself. So I wanted to do it, and I had a love of the subject. I'd also, because I'd done so much in my comparatively young life, learned to sit up late and work hard. You sit up late, you can concentrate, the telephone doesn't ring, you haven't got constant interruptions of people coming in. You can sit down and concentrate. So it was not difficult for me to sit up until 2 o'clock in the morning and concentrate. I could get more done in 4 hours up to 2 a.m. in the morning than you could any other way. So at the end of the day's work, I could do that. But I said, you've got to want to do it. If you have an ambition to do it, you can do a great deal. You can lengthen your working day by habit. And that's how I did it. And it worked. And I'm sure if you wanted to do the same thing, you could do it. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And the next question is from Ms. Satomi Suzuki.
As a political leader of your country, you have met many prominent world figures who made the deepest and most lasting impression upon you, and in what manner?
Well, it's difficult to say, putting out a single one, but the one who was both the closest to my way of thinking and I to his, and who was effective in making the right decision at the right time, was Ronald Reagan. He was a person of principle. If you're to be a successful politician, your beliefs must be founded not on expediency, not on handling, but first on principle. He believed in a free society. He believed in a lesser role for government and a bigger role for people in managing their own affairs. He therefore believed in lower taxation. But he believed in very strong government, strong to do the things which only government can do. That is to say, strong to see that there are strong defense forces, strong to see that there's a good rule of law properly administered, strong to see that the currency of your country is kept sound, strong to see that your finances are sound, strong to see that your taxation is not too high and that the money is well spent, strong to have a very good system of education, because that is the way up for people who start to climb the ladder from the bottom, the ladder that we all started to climb. And also what we would call a safety net in social services to help those people who genuinely, through no fault of their own, either through illness or some tragedy, or because they're too old, simply could not make enough to live, and had lived at a time when they couldn't have saved enough. Now that is the role of government. Now that's what you must concentrate on. If you start to run every industry, if you start to run everything yourself through government, through an enormous civil service, and not carry out your own role properly, and you'll very soon be taking far more than you should in taxation. And the moment you do that, the incentive for people to work for their own future, for their own family's future, goes down. And the most important thing is that the family works for the future. Now, he was also extremely good on international affairs. He and I, again, both had the same thing. Russia had enormous armies spent somewhere between, we're not quite sure how much, but something over 14%, sometimes up to 20% of her national income on weapons and armed forces. She had far more nuclear weapons than we had. And so Ronald Reagan and I both said, well, I was in a little bit before him, within careful expenditure, we're going to spend more on defense, because otherwise we're not able to defend the liberty of our people. We also knew the psychology of it. It's only if you're strong that a dictator, and communists are dictators as much as any others, that a dictator will fear you. And you'll not start a battle if you're strong. So we made our armed forces stronger and stronger. Then he had the stroke of genius because he had the best scientists in the world and in greater number. He said, we're going to go for strategic defense initiative. That is, we know that there are more and more ballistic missiles in the world, Scud missiles. You can put nuclear on the end of a Scud, you can put biological, you can put chemical. And we did not have an effective weapon to stop it from landing. The Patriot will only try to stop it in the last phase. And he wanted a space arrangement that would catch it while it was in the outer space and destroy it there. And you can do it with a system of sensors, we now know, less than you need at the time. So he started that program. That was the stage at which the Soviet Union knew she could not compete. The sophistication of computers that you required were way beyond the capability of anyone in the Soviet Union. And the sophistication of production and operation and the miniaturization of everything. They knew then they could no longer achieve their objective by the threat of military might against nation after nation. And they had a lot of people whom they were threatening or who were afraid. And they had a lot of terrorist movements that they were supporting to be in Africa against some of the colonial governments. They knew. It was then that Mr. Gorbachev came to see me and said, please would you try to persuade President Reagan not to go ahead with Strategic Defense Initiative. I said, no, I certainly won't persuade him not to go ahead. I said, we're helping with it. So these very specialized scientists that we have are fully free to go over there and offer their expertise. We had some highly specialized scientists that were needed for parts of that. So he was streets ahead of anyone else in being able to make the big decisions, to spot the big point, take the decision, stand up for it before the whole world. And so the freedom of America came to the surface. Mr. Gorbachev was also very good in that he knew that the communist system wasn't working and was breaking down, and that with television they would not be able to keep the truth away from their people forever. So he started the Liberty. So there we are. There were three of us there at the same time, each playing a different role. Incidentally, the great need now is to have a defense to ballistic missiles. You could be reached by ballistic missiles from North Korea, easily. Within a few years, all of the capitals in Europe can be reached by ballistic missiles that go further and could be fired from Libya on all of the capitals of Europe. In 20 years, they could reach America. They're going up so fast. That Strategic Defense Initiative effectively was stopped. And what we have to have is a new one called the Sensors in Space, which we must go ahead with. I'm talking about it, Bob Dole is talking about it. Otherwise, we shall find that one of these rogue states will start up wars like Saddam Hussein or Iran, will put a missile on a city, and we shall not have an effective means of stopping it. The same thing that made Ron Reagan want to go ahead with SDI should now make the free countries combine together to go ahead with a global system to stop missiles. If they know there's a system to stop them, you're far less likely to get them coming. So that was he was the best leader, and I must say Gorbachev also understood that communism was on the collapse. Right, thank you.
Thank you very much. The final question is from Ms. Keiko Oki. Ms. Oki, please.
I understand that your husband has been very supportive while you have been involved in the political arena. Do you have any practical advice for those of us looking for husbands?
Well, now look, It all sounds very clinical if you put it down. First, the affection and love has got to be there. It won't last unless it is. Second, I think you've got to have a lot of interests in common. We were friends, both being interested in the economy, in politics, and my husband was a businessman in a chemical and paint industry. I was a scientist, so I knew all the problems of surfaces. I knew the practical problems, so we were able to talk about whether it was the economics, we were able to talk about the scientific things, we were able to talk about the businesses, because I was involved in the food industry. And we also both loved music. So there's a lot in common, and that matters too. The affection, a lot in common. And in the end, my husband, who said, look, you're extremely interested in politics, after the twins were born, and they were coming out about the age of 6, and because I lived in London, it was possible to get back into politics. He said, look, you'll never leave it alone. Why don't you have a go and try to get in? But you see, you can't just dash into a thing. Sometimes I think people dash into things too quickly. They fall in love with someone someday, and then within a month they're married. Well, it just won't do. I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone, but you do want to have things in common if your marriage is to endure, and if you will be able to go through the first row you have, and come through it and say, look, everyone has a tiff now and then. So I can't find him for you, but I'm sure now you'll know pretty well what to look for. Now, are there any volunteers in the room? All right, dear. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now, as an expression of our deepest appreciation, a commemorative gift and bouquet of flowers will be presented to Lady Thatcher by Mr. Ueyama.サッチャー女子の高い見識は国際文化交流に関心を持つ約800名の聴衆に深い感動と感銘を与えました。特に国家試験を目前に控えたハローの生徒にとっては、女子の温かい励ましの言葉が何よりも大きな力となったことでしょう。サッチャー女子は来年以降も毎年ハローに来られる予定ですので、次回はどのような素晴らしいお話が聞けるのか今から楽しみです。